On the 15th of February, 1942, over 15,000 Australian soldiers laid down their weapons in Singapore. They had been told the island was a fortress. They had been promised the British Empire would protect them. And in less than 2 months of fighting, the entire strategy collapsed. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. For Australia, it was something worse. It was a betrayal. Nearly a quarter of the country's overseas fighting force had just been handed to the Japanese Imperial Army. But the fall of Singapore was not the end of their suffering. For thousands of those captured Australians, it was only the beginning. This is the story of what happened to them on the Burma Railway, a stretch of track that earned a different name among the men forced to build it. They called it the Death Railway, and by the time it was finished, that name had been paid for in full. To understand how these Australians ended up in the jungle, you have to go back to the months before Singapore fell. In February 1941, Australia had sent the 8th Division to Malaya and Singapore to reinforce British defenses against a possible Japanese invasion. The men who shipped out were volunteers. Under Australian law at the time, only volunteers could serve overseas. These were not career soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, factory workers, and tradesmen who had signed up to do their part. The problem was that the British strategy for defending Singapore was built on assumptions that turned out to be dead wrong. The British believed the dense Malayan jungle was impassable. They thought the Japanese would never attempt an invasion through it, but the Japanese did exactly that. On the 8th of December, 1941, Japanese forces landed in northern Malaya and southern Thailand. They moved with a speed that nobody had planned for, cycling through the jungle on bicycles and outflanking every defensive line the Allies tried to hold. By late January, the entire Malay Peninsula had fallen. The Australians of the 8th Division fought hard in several engagements. They pulled off an ambush at Gamas. They destroyed 8 Japanese tanks at Bakri, but it was not enough. The Japanese had air superiority and they controlled the sea. When they crossed the Johor Strait onto Singapore Island on the 8th of February 1942, they landed directly on the Australian sector, overwhelming the 218th and 220th battalions. 1 week later, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered. Around 80,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war. More than 15,000 of them were Australian. Their commanding officer, Major General Gordon Bennett, controversially escaped on the night of the surrender, leaving his men behind. Those men were marched into Changi, the prison complex that would become the staging ground for far worse things to come. At first, Changi was grim but survivable. The Australians occupied Selarang barracks and tried to make the best of captivity. They organized sports, held classes, and maintained military discipline. But the Japanese had plans for them. Those plans involved a railway. After their defeats at the Coral Sea and Midway in mid-1942, Japan could no longer safely supply its forces in Burma by sea. Allied ships and submarines made the shipping lanes too dangerous, so the Japanese High Command ordered the construction of a railway linking Thailand to southern Burma, a 415-kilometer line through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Dense malarial jungle, river valleys, and mountain passes stood in the way. Japanese engineers surveyed the route and estimated it would take 5 years to build. The Japanese military gave them 15 months. To make that deadline possible, the Japanese pulled labor from every source they had. Roughly 200,000 Asian civilians, mostly Burmese and Malay laborers, were conscripted under false promises of paid work, and over 60,000 Allied prisoners of war, including around 13,000 Australians, were shipped from camps across Southeast Asia to construction sites along the route. Among the Allied prisoners were 30,000 British, 18,000 Dutch, and 700 Americans. The Australians left Changi in waves, organized into workforces with letter designations. A force was the first to go, 3,000 men under Brigadier Arthur Varley, sent to the Burma end of the railway in May 1942. Other forces followed throughout 1942 and 1943, traveling by train, truck, and foot to work camps spaced every 8 to 17 kilometers along the route. When the men arrived, what they found was nothing like what they had been told. The Japanese had promised better food and conditions outside Changi. Instead, the prisoners found open-sided bamboo barracks crammed with 200 men each, giving every man a space barely half a meter wide to sleep. Rations consisted of small servings of rice, often rotten, supplemented by whatever vegetables or scraps the men could find. Clean water was scarce. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. The work itself was medieval. With hand tools, picks, shovels, and a wide hoe the men called a chunkle, prisoners cleared jungle, hauled timber, and laid track. They moved earth in woven baskets and rice sacks slung from bamboo poles. They built more than 600 bridges. They cut embankments out of rock by drilling holes with hammers and steel tap bits, then packing the holes with explosives. One man held the drill, another swung the hammer. If the hammer missed, fingers were crushed, and the work never stopped. Shifts ran 12 hours, then 16, then 18. The physical labor was devastating, but the diseases were worse. Malaria was everywhere. Nearly every man contracted it, many with chronic infections of the vivax and falciparum strains. Dysentery tore through the camps, leaving men too weak to stand but forced to work anyway. Beriberi, caused by severe vitamin deficiency, swelled limbs and damaged hearts. And then there were the tropical ulcers, open wounds that ate through flesh down to the bone. One Australian doctor, Rowley Richards, described them as looking like some kind of animal had been chewing through a man's leg. The only treatment was to scrape out the dead tissue with a spoon without anesthetic. Sometimes the only option was amputation. And amputations in jungle camps, performed with improvised tools and no proper medicine, killed many of the men they were meant to save. If you're learning something from this video, hit subscribe. I cover military history and untold stories like this every week. Now, the conditions on the railway were brutal from the start, but in mid-1943, they became something else entirely. The Japanese called it Speedo. Construction had fallen behind schedule. The railway needed to be finished by October 1943, and the Japanese engineers responded by demanding more labor, longer hours, and faster results. From April through October 1943, the Speedo period pushed every camp on the railway to its breaking point. Prisoners who had been expected to drill 1 meter of rock per day were now ordered to drill 2 or 3 meters. Workdays stretched to 15 and 18 hours. The monsoon rains turned camps into swamps and hillside work sites into mudslides. The Japanese guards, under pressure from their own commanders, responded to any slowdown with violence. The worst of it happened at a place called Hellfire Pass, located in the Tenasserim Hills of Thailand, about 150 kilometers from the start of the railway. Hellfire Pass was the deepest and longest rock cutting on the entire route. 75 meters long and 25 meters deep, it had to be carved through semi-marbleized limestone by hand. The Japanese could have built a tunnel, which would have cost far less human life, but a tunnel could only be worked from two ends. A cutting could be attacked from every point at once, so they chose the cutting. During the Speedo, prisoners at Hellfire Pass worked around the clock, lit by oil lamps and burning bamboo torches. The flickering light, the relentless hammering, the shuffling of hundreds of starving men, it created a scene that survivors said looked exactly like something out of hell. That is how it got its name. Over the 6 weeks it took to complete the main cutting, 69 men were beaten to death by Japanese guards. Many more died from cholera, exhaustion, and starvation. Australian soldiers from D Force and H Force were among those who carved it out. But even Hellfire Pass was not the worst posting on the railway. That distinction belongs to F Force. In April 1943, a mixed force of around 7,000 Australians and British was assembled at Changi. The Japanese had promised the officers that these men were being sent somewhere with more food and better conditions. Many of the men selected were already sick. An estimated 30% of the British contingent was unfit for work before they even left Singapore. Worse, many had received only one of 2 required cholera inoculations. F Force traveled by train to Bampong in Thailand, packed into steel rice trucks, 27 or 28 men per car, with no seats, no toilets, and almost no food. From Bompong, they were forced to march nearly 300 kilometers through the jungle to their work camps near the Thai-Burma border. The march was conducted mostly at night to avoid the extreme heat, but when the monsoon arrived in May, the trails became impassable mud. Staging posts along the way were filthy, already used by Asian laborers and contaminated with disease. By the time F Force reached its destination, the men were already collapsing, and then the cholera arrived. Cholera could kill a man in 2 days. Private Cliff Bayliss of the 230th Battalion was diagnosed on the 1st of June at Upper Songkrai Camp. He was dead by the 3rd. In May and June of 1943 alone, cholera killed 571 members of F Force. By the end of June, 46% of all prisoners at Lower Songkrai were suffering from malaria and 38% from dysentery. F Force's camps were so remote that supply lines barely functioned, and the Japanese administrative structure was split between two competing commands in Thailand and Malaya, which meant neither took proper responsibility for the prisoners. By the time the railway was completed in October 1943, F Force had suffered a death rate of 44%. Of the 7,000 men who left Changi, more than 3,000 died. The Australians lost 1,060 men. The British lost over 2,000. In the middle of all this suffering, there were men who fought to keep others alive, none more famous than Lieutenant Colonel Edward Dunlop, known to every man who served under him as Weary. The nickname came from a joke about his last name, Dunlop, like the tire brand. Tires get weary. The name stuck. Dunlop was a surgeon from Wangaratta, Victoria, who had played rugby union for Australia and excelled as a boxer at Melbourne University. He had served in the Middle East, at Tobruk and in Greece, before being transferred to Java just weeks before it fell to the Japanese. When the hospital he commanded at Bandung was overrun, Dunlop had a chance to escape. He stayed behind to protect his patients. On the Burma Railway, Dunlop commanded a force of roughly 900 men who arrived at the Konyu region in January 1943. He performed surgeries in jungle camps with improvised instruments and no anesthetic. He operated on tropical ulcers, amputated limbs, and treated cholera patients while suffering from amoebic dysentery, beriberi, and malaria himself. He gave his own food rations to the sickest men, and on more than one occasion he physically placed himself between his patients and Japanese soldiers who had decided a wounded man was not worth keeping alive. One of his men, the author Donald Stewart, described him as a lighthouse of sanity in a universe of madness and suffering. Dunlop was one of 106 Australian doctors captured by the Japanese and one of 44 who served on the railway. He was not the only hero, but he became the most famous, and after the war, he spent the rest of his life fighting for the welfare of former prisoners, advocating for their medical care, lobbying governments on their behalf, and eventually, remarkably, promoting reconciliation with Japan. The railway was completed on the 16th of October 1943. A copper spike was driven at the meeting point by the Japanese general overseeing the project. Over the 15 months of construction, more than 12,000 Allied prisoners of war had died. Around 2,800 of them were Australian, but the Allied death toll was dwarfed by the suffering of the Asian civilian laborers. More than 90,000 of the roughly 200,000 conscripted Ramusha perished. Many of their names were never recorded. After the war, Australia tried 924 Japanese servicemen for war crimes across the Asia Pacific. Of these, 644 were convicted and 137 were executed. Specifically for crimes on the Burma Railway, 111 were convicted and 32 were put to death. Lieutenant General Aiguma Ishida, the overall commander of the railway project, received a 10-year prison sentence. Several of his subordinate officers were sentenced to death. The railway itself did not last. Allied bombers repeatedly destroyed bridges along the line, and after the Japanese surrender in August 1945, much of the track was torn up or reclaimed by the jungle. Today, only sections remain in use. but the sites where men suffered and died have not been forgotten. At Kanchanaburi in Thailand, 2 Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries hold the remains of Allied soldiers who died on the railway. The Hellfire Pass itself was lost to the jungle for decades after the war. In the 1980s, a group of former prisoners of war, including Tom Morris, pushed to have the site rediscovered and preserved. Today, the Hellfire Pass Memorial Museum, co-sponsored by the Australian and Thai governments, stands as a tribute to the men who carved that cutting with their bare hands. Every year on Anzac Day, a dawn service is held at Hellfire Pass. The last known surviving worker of the entire Burma Railway, Arumugam Kanasamy, a civilian laborer who was trafficked to the railway site at the age of 15, died in November 2024 at the age of 97. The story of the Australian prisoners on the Death Railway is not a story about a battle. It is a story about what happens to ordinary men when they are abandoned by the strategy that sent them to war, and what it costs to survive when the people holding you captive do not consider your life worth preserving. More than a third of the 22,000 Australians captured by the Japanese in Southeast Asia died in captivity. That accounts for roughly 20% of all Australian deaths in the entire Second World War. These men were not forgotten, but for a long time they were overshadowed. The Burma Railway has since taken its place alongside Gallipoli and Kokoda as one of the defining experiences of Australian military history, not because of a victory, because of what was endured. If you want to hear about another group of Australian prisoners of war who faced even worse odds, learn about the Sandakan death marches in Borneo, where only 6 out of 2,500 men survived. Subscribe so you do not miss it.